for those that are hoping to listen into the recording. But I do really appreciate everyone making time to be here with us live today. I'm thrilled to have you all here while I'm sharing my insights, and do get involved in today's webinar using the chat box. So the chat box is the way we're going to be using for people to ask questions, and we're going to have certain pause points in the webinar where we go to questions. So without further ado, let's just get ourselves into learning mode. So today I'm going to be reviewing what I've learned at the 3 different conferences I've attended recently: the AITD 2016 across in Denver, the CLO Symposium in Florida, USA, and the AITD here in Sydney. I'm going to be sharing with you some of the key themes from the conference keynoters, some of the trends that I've picked up across conferences, and then a short piece of course on learning transfer. Now, what I would say is that for today's webinar, in some ways we are going for the mission impossible. So I'm going to be taking 9 days of conference attending into 1 hour. So it's going to be a little bit fast and furious, and it's going to be a pretty intense learning and reflection process. So I really encourage you, you've made the time to come to the webinar today. Let's be present. Let's put aside any multitasking and just give ourselves this 1 hour of learning. And that way we can interact on the chat box and really get the most of this session and the time. Now, I'm not going to be on video the whole session. I'm finding it a bit off-putting. And I'm not sure whether it gives people the chance to concentrate fully. But we have got slides, and I'll certainly be popping back and forth on video. So we're going to be kicking off right now. So I might just remove myself in the live version, and we'll go to the importance of learning. So first slide here is a shot from the AITD across in Denver, and wow, what an auditorium, absolutely immense. The whole conference had over 10,000 attendees, 83 countries represented, and this was the opening keynote of Simon Sinek. So to take you through the 3 keynotes from the AITD, Simon Sinek was first up. You may have known of Simon Sinek's work. He's very famous for his TED Talk, The Power of Why. But he was actually talking about a topic, why leaders each last, why some teams come together and others don't. So the whole premise of Simon's talk was about the chemistry of the brain and how humans are hardwired to react in different ways to certain triggers. So he talked about the leader's role being to create the conditions for positive brain chemistry to be triggered for individuals. And he said the most important of these was to create the feeling of trust. He talked about the external dangers that people feel. So when we say external, it's external to the organization, such as the competition and the economy and things which people have very little control over. And he used this to stress why it's really important, therefore, within organizations to work to create safety and trust so that people can work in an environment without fear and do their best work. And he spent time telling stories, taking us back to kind of the caveman response and how the brain operates under those circumstances. He had a really great vision of creating workplaces where people can show up to do the work that they love and feel safe in doing what they want to do and take care of each other. So really inspiring talk from Simon Sinek. Second, of course, was Brené Brown, was equally inspiring. And she shared with us that she came from an L&D background. So I'm not sure whether many people know that about Brené Brown. Again, very famous for her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. So what she was sharing about was courageous cultures and brave leaders. And Brené Brown said that she feels that being a leader is one of the hardest things that she's ever done. And she stated that there's absolutely nothing comfortable about being a leader, and that leaders need to be vulnerable on a daily basis. One of the parts that I most love about her presentation, when she was talking about the stories that we tell ourselves, she had a lovely quote. She said, "When we deny our stories, they define us. When we own our stories, we get to write the ending." So I'm going to say that just one more time because I love it so much. When we deny our stories, they define us. When we own our stories, we get to write the ending. And she shared a phrase that she often uses when she's about to go into this position of being vulnerable and share what's happening for her at a given moment, whether that's outside of work or inside of work. And she uses the phrase, the story I'm telling myself right now. And she says that's really useful for starting conversations where you need to go into sharing what's happening for you. So fantastic work by Brené Brown, and the room was equally full as for Simon Sinek. Now, the third and final keynote from the AITD was Jeremy Gauthier. And I've got to tell you, he was at the end of a 4.5 days in the US, and I was a little bit in conference overload by this stage, so I probably wasn't the most present I could possibly be for Jeremy's session. But Jeremy's website is trendhunter.com, so do feel free to check that out. And he was talking about innovation, and he was challenging us to think innovatively about learning and to think about how we can do things differently. So interestingly, one of his counterintuitive things he suggested was that a great way to innovate is to forget about past successes. So he says often businesses or teams look at things they've been successful in the past and try and build on top of those. And what he felt is that to really be innovative, you need to forget your past successes and start with a clean slate. So a challenging thought, but really interesting. And if anyone has any thoughts or comments, feel free to add in the chat box as we go through. But I know there's quite a bit to take in. So if you're rather be in listening mode, that also works well. So that was the AITD, which is in Denver. On to the summary of the keynoters from the CLO, which is the Chief Learning Officers Symposium Spring Program. So Gretchen Rubin was the first keynoter at this conference, and she was talking about Better Than Before, which was essentially about the power of habits and how habits are formed and changed. And her first book was about happiness, and she really said the key to most people's happiness is the habits that they have. And this is why she then went on to research and develop around habits. So the main focus of her presentation was talking about the 4 different personality types she's identified in terms of how people move towards goals and change habits. And she linked it to how different people respond to expectations. Now, from a behavioural change point of view, it was absolutely fascinating. And we could spend an hour alone just digging into this. It's one of those keynotes where I immediately went online and bought her book. So I'm not going to go through the 4 different types now, but feel free again to research that further if it's something that really resonates with you. One of her easier to grasp principles, though, which I also loved, was about the power of taking outer control to create inner calm. And she gave the example of one of her clients who really wanted to move forward in their career, but needed to create some inner calm to be able to look at that. And to do that, they organised their fridge. So a small task, such as taking power of this outer control, created additional inner calm. She also shared a fascinating study around people who make their bed every day as a habit, without fail, feel that they have more control over their lives than those that don't. So some interesting thoughts there from Gretchen. So on from Gretchen, who was interesting in one aspect, to Jeffrey Pfeffer, who was interesting in another. Jeffrey was the keynoter at the conference, and I think he was there to bring controversy. He started by throwing out a few statistics about leadership, and you can see there the title of his talk was Leadership BS, which is also the title of his latest book. So he shared that out of 142 countries that Gallup polled, 13% of employees were engaged and 24% of employees were actively disengaged, with everywhere else somewhere in the middle. So that's a Gallup survey that was across 142 countries. He also shared a DDI survey that a third of people out of 1,300 surveyed did not find their manager effective. And his final quote was that a survey from the Centre of Creative Leadership found that 50% of all leaders and managers were currently ineffective in their role. So Jeffrey used this as a platform to highlight how we have a real problem with leadership training and education at the moment in the learning profession. And he went on to share how he believes that the field of leadership training was really about entertainment rather than learning. He questioned the need for leaders to be authentic, saying it was quite dangerous for companies. And I have to say, I was sat in the audience thinking, I really don't agree with what Jeffrey's sharing with us here. But the US attendees, some of them were absolutely loving it. So I don't think I've ever been involved in a leadership program which is more about entertainment than behavioural change. So I was a little bit challenged, but clearly a controversial one in the lineup certainly gets people speaking in the breaks. So I think that was Jeffrey's main contribution, certainly from my point of view. Brian Robertson from Holacracy was the next keynote. And this was one of the highlights of the conference for me. I was very excited to be hearing Brian speak. I don't know those of you who have come across Frederick Laloh's book, and I'm going to, perhaps Jess, we can pop Frederick's name in the chat box, just because I'm not very good on my pronunciations. His book is called Reinventing Organizations, and it's been my absolute read of the year. And I'm going to be including that in our prize bundle today. And one of the topics within that book is about self-managed teams and how organizations need to change their hierarchy and structures to be more effective and more relevant to the way people want to work today. What's interesting, though, is that Brian raised, although self-managed teams sound as if we're creating a much looser running environment for organizations, he said we really need to create the boundaries, rules, structure, clarity, and constraints that enable these structures to work. So on one hand, we're looking at self-managed teams, but on the other hand, Brian was sharing with us the sort of boundaries, rules, and structures that you need to make those function. And Holacracy is a software tool that Brian's developed that helps bring teams together in a self-managed way. It's probably a little bit broader than that too. So holacracy.org is perhaps worth checking out. So from Brian, we went to Michelle Guylan, and Michelle spoke about happiness. Michelle was a former newsreader, and she was so fed up of the sound of the bad news that she wanted to move into the field of happiness and become a lot more positive in the area she was working in. She talked about social support being a long-term predictor of happiness and success. So whether that's social support within our organisations or outside of our organisations, that can help create happiness and success. And one of the other things which I loved about Michelle's presentation was she talked about fact-checking our own stories. So when we're telling ourselves what's actually happening within our organisation or maybe within our learning programs, to really check the facts behind that. And she really urged us away from, it's all going horribly wrong, to maybe there's one piece within that that just needs to change. So I love that idea of fact-checking, and of course really sat well with the Brené Brown story focus too. So some great keynotes from Florida, and then of course onto our own AITD conference here in Australia. And good to have you online from the AITD, Neil. So I'm sure if people have got questions, they can pop them in the chat box to you. So first up was Donald Clark, and Donald actually had two keynotes at the conference. He was from Scotland, and I think it's fair to say he was a very fast speaker, very entertaining presenter. The first presentation he gave was about learning theory, and he basically took us through from the Greeks, the religious educator, the constructionists, and a whole host of others, right through to today's online learning technologists, and did a whiz through of learning through the ages and the principles and models that they worked under. I learnt a lot in that presentation. But the bottom line that Donald was looking to share with us was that there's been more pedagogic change in the last 20 years than that of the previous 2000. That education is predominantly a slow learner, and that technology really will shape the future. And in fact, that led on to his second keynote of the conference, in that the future was already here. and he was talking about technology and particularly about AI. Now, in terms of AI, that was quite a lot for me to get my head around. And I would suggest is further research if you're interested in AI. Donald had a really good website called Plan B Learning, and that could be one to check out. A lot of great articles on there. Next, we had the wonderful Gert Dreisen talking with us. And Ger was from the Netherlands, and he spoke about the lessons we can learn from Van Gogh. And one of the particular lessons he talked about was productivity. So Ger shared with us that Van Gogh, the painter, was only actually painting for 10 years. And during that time, he painted 800 paintings, 1,000 sketches, and wrote 900 letters. So productivity was clearly very key. Ger had gone through the letters and sketches and drawings, and incidentally, he actually lived near where Van Gogh worked for a certain period, and had created 9 insights from Van Gogh's life and what we can learn about learning. The one I enjoyed most was about getting a fresh perspective. And one of the things Ger talks about is the difference between déjà vu, where you've seen things before, and vue d'ajay, even, where we can look at things completely differently. And he said, if we think about when Van Gogh was painting, and most people would be painting pictures in the daytime, Van Gogh chose to paint a starry night in the dark because he saw that the colours in the starry night were much stronger in the daytime. So that's an example of where Van Gogh was very famous for thinking outside of the box, and Ger encouraged us to think outside of the box and inside the box to get a different perspective. So moving on from Ger, I was lucky enough to be invited to keynote at the AITD this year to focus on learning transfer and the learning transfer minefield. And if I really had to synthesize what the real essence of the keynote was, the main thing we talked about was the different ways people are talking about learning transfer at the moment: sustainability, reinforcement, transfer, and embedding. Yet what that really boils down to is people wanting to get behavioural change. So I then went on to explore the difference between reflection for creating behavioural change and reminding for creating behavioural change, and how that with reflection we will create a more sustained outcome. So we're going to have a little bit of a deep dive into learning transfer later. Of course, I couldn't resist, but we'll stick on the keynotes for now. So the final keynote at the AITD was Dr. Anne Bartlett-Bragg. And it was interesting because Anne spoke about the red herring of technology, in that we've been sold the story that technology is going to help us in our work lives, make them easier. Yet we're at the point almost now where we have so many different devices, so many platforms, that it can be overwhelming to actually manage the amount of technology that we have in our lives and in our business. So Anne was challenging us that when we're looking at learning technology and technology within our organisations, we need to really look at information literacy that we have, the level of network literacy that we have, and also the level of participatory mindset that we have within organisations. And Anne raised the point that unless there's a high level of participation, our social networks and our internal learning networks won't thrive, as the ecosystems need participation to create value. So really fascinating from a digital perspective to hear what Anne had to say. So as you can see and hear, a wealth of knowledge, insights and experience from the keynotes that have been across the conferences. And what I'd do is encourage you just to take a moment. I don't know if you've been making notes or just sat listening, but maybe just pull out one thing that was most relevant to you from those keynotes. And to try and help, we've pulled out what we were thinking some of the key highlights were. And I'm going to invite you maybe to share in the chat box, or if you'd rather just write your own notes, do. But let's just take a moment just to think of one particular thing which is most important for you from the keynotes where I've just shared there. Craig, that really resonated with me, the story I'm telling myself. Yeah, quite fascinating. Thanks for sharing. Maria, anything for yourself? Perhaps Kelly, you want to jump in? Oh, thanks, Neil. Yes, social support is a long-term indicator. Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, Ravina. Yeah, participatory mindsets I thought was particularly interesting too. Kelly, you're with Craig and myself on the story. Great. So guys, just jot that down for yourselves as we think about how those could be relevant. Yeah, I like that, Neil. Good to consider, good way to put that habit in place. And thanks, Tracy. Great. So I'm going to move us on to thinking about what some of the trends were as I came across the conference. And to sort of pull these together, I really reviewed my key learnings and what I was taking away and what I'd sort of heard multiple times in different ways, and also just some of my favorites from the conferences. So the first trend is around culture. And Sharon, I think this kind of plays in certainly to Simon Sinek's creating a workplace where people want to show up. Because in many of the conferences, and particularly at the CLO Symposium, culture was almost front and center of every presentation, and particularly focusing on the strength of leaders within organizations. And one of the interesting aspects that was shared was we had at the CLO, we had a company called Flight Car present. And so Flight Car was a bit like the Airbnb for cars, where you take your car to the airport, and as you're traveling overseas, you actually rent out your car to someone else visiting your home city. So quite a fascinating concept. It's not yet in Australia, but it may be soon. And 90% of their workforce was between 80 to 30 years old. Now, Patrick Coyner, who's the Vice President of People and Training from Flightcar, was sharing that they do monthly engagement surveys of their employees and immediately use the information to create changes. And this compared to General Motors, which were also presenting at the conference, and they had the example of doing an engagement survey once every 2 years, with the recognition that often by the time they've got the results collated up to 4 months after the end of the survey, they could well be out of date. And so there was this real comparison as we went through the conference of the difference between startup and a sort of a younger, more dynamic organization and some of the enterprise organizations. The other thing that Patrick shared in his startup organization, he's often required to create in 3 days what in previous roles he would have spent 3 months, him and his team, creating. And he said the speed of the startup business is just so immense that they need the speed of the learning to be like that too. Another great thing that Patrick shared is that when they're evaluating the success of their learning, rather than asking extensive evaluation questionnaires, they focus on one question: tell us what you think. And they're obtaining really useful data in that way. So I thought that was an interesting point. So Rahul Varma, the Chief Learning Officer at Accenture, was also presenting at the CLO. He was on a panel, and he was sharing the new leadership skills that he was seeing as important within the organization. And he noted those skills as leaders who have the ability to reinvent, leaders who are relevant, leaders who have the ability to be relevant, and leaders who have the ability to be compassionate. So that was his new take on what he's requiring from the leaders within Accenture. He also shared from within Accenture the change in performance management systems and processes away from annual to ongoing, which I think is sort of happening particularly started off in the consulting firms. And all of these points were really at the heart of culture being important to organizational learning and organizational change. So the next trend I'm looking at is push and pull. And Maria, I think I'm just chatting in the back books, push and pull, interesting. Yeah, it's so much easier to push content, use the strategies we can use to engage learners. So I can see that a few people are agreeing with that one. And really, to build on that, one of the other things that Rahul shared from Accenture is that they're moving away from the Accenture University that they'd created, where that housed the content and the learning modules. And don't misunderstand me, I'm sure he's not actually shutting it down. I think they're probably just changing their focus slightly, because he shared that people were finding what they needed in terms of learning quicker from YouTube or Google than they would the online university. And he found that people within Accenture, particularly millennials, are really loving learning boards. Now, the interesting thing about the learning boards that he created was that they had over 140,000 active users, which is about 40% of the company, and there had been zero corporate push on that. So it had been a completely pull, people getting involved in the learning boards without any corporate push. So another interesting aspect of push and pull was shared by Mimi Brent, who's the head of global career development for General Motors. And she said one of the most popular learning resources that her team and her had created for the organization that year was 50 ways to develop your employees. And when I heard that, I thought, well, that sounds exactly like the type of article that you might find on Google or YouTube. So clearly, Maria, to your point, they're kind of going into that, how do we market and create things that people want to pull towards them? And it sounds as if Mimi and her team were really going from a marketing angle with that 50 ways to develop your employees. So as we've all said here on the chat box, the conference predicted that in the future, people will want less of pushing of learning to them and more of pulling towards them what they want. And we'll touch on this a little bit more when we talk about learning transfer. The trend of micro learning. Micro learning seemed to be the most most talked about aspect of e-learning, I would say, at the conferences. It's not an area that know a great deal about, but it was interesting. Matthew Mason at the AITD talked about the importance of considering the aspects of the technology you're using, the consumption of the learning, and the intention of the learner as the three key areas to consider. Elliot Macy, who those that read my blog will know he's one of my favourites, also shared at the ATD, and he had a huge session. I mean, it was a breakout session, but there must have been, I don't know, maybe 1,000 people in his breakout. How we've outsourced so much of our lives and our memories to our smartphone. Why not learning? And micro is a way to do that. He raised that online learning completion rates are a real challenge, and that the typical completion rate for a Coursera-type course is between 3 and 7%. So maybe this is where micro and flexibility will have more of an impact. There was another interesting aspect of micro that was discussed at the AITD, which was an interesting point from Anne Bartlett-Bragg from the Ripple Effect Group, who was one of the keynoters also. Anne shared within micro that she felt strongly we needed to consider what she called the scaffold. And so the scaffold is the framework that the micro learning sits within so that it's relevant and useful. And so she said to be wary of actually just putting out micro content without people really understanding the context and how it all flows together. So I thought interesting from a micro viewpoint. Kelly, if there's something else that you want to add on to flesh out about your Linda or the question and how that's folding in, please do just flesh that out a little bit more. And Neil, yes, I'm sure you've got more about micro learning up your sleeve across all platforms. Yeah, to help people synthesize that easier. Great. So moving on to the trend of what people were saying about LMSs. And, you know, again, Elliot's voice is one that I listen to within the world of learning technology. And his view is that LMSs are currently a really challenging area and are definitely ripe for transformation. So he stated that 70 to 75% of LMS customers are either frustrated, annoyed, or feel their LMS systems are performing under the capacity of what they need at the moment. He felt the biggest challenge within LMSs is actually the lack of effective search, which he said is very important for learning. And the biggest opportunity is personalization. And he really called LMSs to account, saying that if Amazon can recommend to me what book I might be interested in, given my current selection of what I'm actually buying, then why can't our LMS do the same for us? So I think watch this space is the message there. Great. So Kelly, you've had some experiences where people have used online, Linda online instead of training in a room, and the employers are happy to do that. And Kelly, I don't know whether you want to, would you describe Linda as micro or more of a longer length session? It'd be good just to hear your thoughts, Kelly, if you've got more on that for people to learn from you as we're going through this. So guys, there were the key trends that I sort of saw across the conferences. One of the interesting things is, there are, when you're at the larger conferences and certainly at AITD as well, there's so many conference sessions to choose from. Partly you can be getting a little bit in that conference headlight of so many sessions to choose from, where shall I put my time? And I think often, our time goes towards our interest. Great. So we've got a couple of thoughts there from Kelly and Craig on Linda and micro. Yeah, great. And so Kelly will come on to what an employee is watching when we talk about learning transfer a little bit in time too. But I just want us to take another moment to pause and reflect from that trend section. If there's a particular trend that is of interest to you, or that you need to could use that trend section to move forward some of the learning in your workplace. And again, we've got a summary, a sort of a summary style of trends there. Maria, I think I'm with you on that. I think, and again, this kind of really comes into the learning transfer section, this question of the effectiveness of micro. We watch something, but how do we stop and reflect on the change we're now making this new implementation? I'm with you. I think the key thing is we've got to make sure that it's not just about learning the content, but that we actually get the behavioural change. And I think if it's something that someone needs immediately in that moment, we're much more likely to get that change. If it's something that someone's pulled towards them because they know they need it and they need to learn it, then that will work well. But if it is something that we need to stretch them with and they maybe don't see the relevance to them or how much they need it, then that's going to be another behavioural change discussion to be had. Craig, I think wondering why you have an LMS, I think that's sort of where Elliot was heading with it as well. So I think he's feeling there's a much more flexible ways to look at it. Interesting, Kate. I think we could have a separate discussion on LMS. Oh, Tracy, tell us about WMS. That may have escaped me. As I say, the technology is not my key forte. So if you want to put more in the chat box there, that would be great. And Neil, with you, the culture can be linked with the push-pull as well. Ooh, we've got WCMS. I'm going to have to get straight on Google. Won't do it now, team, obviously. Key to keep us on track. And learning boards. So that's come up for people. Rahul didn't actually go into detail of what he meant on the learning boards, but I'm sure that's something we can research. My take on it was really that they were like discussion forums, and that's certainly something that we've started within our business here, is a forum where people can ask questions of their colleagues, and that's certainly been proved really beneficial and interesting for getting people engaged and getting people learning from each other. And it may, Craig, who knows, maybe it was Pinterest. Perhaps we'll do a bit of researching, perhaps look out for a blog on that in the future. Okay, so Guys, one of the interesting points I want us to just think about here while we're reflecting and sharing some ideas, which is really great, is that when we're thinking about what we're learning or what we're observing, also be thinking about for yourselves, well, what am I going to do with this? What could be most useful for me to think about implementing? So one of the things I often challenge people is don't just think about what you're learning, but what are you physically going to do with it? Thanks, Kate. Neil, I think that's a good summary. It's a good summary. Okay. So I'm loving the chat box. Love it if we could actually just sit around chatting as well on this piece. I am going to keep us moving forward though. I'd like to start us on a bit of a fanfare. Of course, is this the most exciting part of the webinar about to happen about learning transfer? Who knows? Of course, I'm biased. But what was really exciting was to see the increasing importance of learning transfer on the international conference agenda. So I've attended the AITD conference in the US for 5 out of the last 6 years. And until this last time in Denver, there were probably 1 or 2 sessions maybe about learning transfer. And wait for it, this time, 11 learning transfer sessions at the conference. So there's clearly a need, and it's increasingly important topic. Of course, there was a session that Michelle Ockers from Coca-Cola Amatil and I delivered, which was our Learning Transfer Gold, Lessons from Down Under, where we shared a case study from work we'd done with Michelle's team. There was a repeat of Art Cohn's session, which I shared about last year. And I think that was a popular session. I think that's why he was back sharing that. And this year was also joined by presentations by Wilson Learning and Ken Blanchard companies. What was interesting though is a lot of people still seem to be focusing on what can be done before or during learning, and particularly classroom, rather than what needs to happen afterwards. And I'm sure if people have heard me talk about this before, I really see that it's where people get focused on the part that's easiest to control rather than the part that's going to have the biggest impact. There was also a lot of talk still about helping people remember and reminding people about their learning. And I think this partly goes into, because neuroscience is so on trend at the moment and all how the brain works, that because we can now prove more about memory than we ever knew before, people are really hooking into that. But I still stand wedded to that, for the most part, we're training very intelligent people who, if they can't remember something off the top of their head, can look it up. And that what we really need to be doing is looking at not whether they remember it, but what are they actually doing it, and to really focus on behavioural change. So here on the slide, for those that don't know, this is a picture of the lovely Cal Wick. Cal, I consider Cal from Fort Hill Company in the US to be the forefather of modern day learning transfer. He's actually also just such a nice guy. He's wonderful. He created the Friday Fives back in I believe it was back in the 80s, which then morphed into Results Engine, which people may have heard of. And Cal and Kathy, who's the president of Fort Hill, have really taken a leap forward with the tool that they've produced now, which is actually 70/20. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen a blog that I wrote about this a while back. It was sort of in beta last year, and that's really come on further. And the thing that I love particularly about this tool is that it's not about just sending out content. It has the facility that it can send out content, but it's more about getting people to reflect and be accountable and share what's actually happening for them. So he really takes into account, what I talk about in terms of the specific and structured reflection and accountability. And Maria, I think this links back to your point around micro-learning and how can we get people accountable to that, and it particularly being something that people pull towards them rather than it's pushed at them. So one of the examples for us is, most of you know our process happens over the phone. We always have participants calling in on that phone number so that it's something that they drive rather than their TLA specialists, turning learning into action, calling out to them. So because the more an individual has ownership, the more they will create and move forward with it. And in fact, that really surprised me about the majority of the sessions around learning transfer, that there still wasn't actually that much talk about actual accountability for change within the transfer process. And I think that when we really start to think about accountability, that's what will actually create the change. It's a very powerful part of it, and still not talked about very much. So that's a little section on learning transfer. So again, as you might want to just either create any immediate reflections around transfer or anything that's important to you around that. And before we get on to our prize draw, which I'm very excited about, our 3-book giveaway, and of course our bit of our experiment that we're going to be looking at this morning, I'm sure you won't mind if I just do a very quick plug for our learning transfer. Oh, in fact, I'm going to answer Greta's question first. Go back a slide. Greta, thanks for asking that. So the Friday Fives, which was a tool which Cal Wick, was an online tool that Cal created, as I say, I think it was back in the 80s. And the idea was that every Friday, he wanted people to sit down and reflect on 5 things that they had learnt in that week, or 5 ways that they had implemented their learning that week. And this was way before, you know, we have our Twitter catchphrases for certain days. But Friday Fives was the learning day that Cal created. Interestingly, just nipping back to Rahul from Accenture at the CLO, he talked about wanting people to reflect on 1 thing every day that they have learnt. And I'm sure for Cal and Kathy at 70/20, that would really play into their strategy as well, just to get people used to reflecting about learning. So I think he called it, you know, the 1 a day learning culture. So very quick plug, guys, and I won't go through this in a great deal of detail, but most of you know that Lever Transfer of Learning, we have a really big commitment to raising the standard of learning transfer globally, so that we're a key contributor to business success. And we've got a proven track record of results within learning transfer. I'm really keen to connect with either heads of learnings, vice presidents of learnings departments, and talk to them about the diagnostic that I have been developing. Now, it may sound like a little bit of a sales pitch, and guys, you know, I won't be shy. If I think I can help companies, I do say. But people are finding this diagnostic framework is a really useful way to look at their learning, breaking it down into what am I doing that's stretch, what am I doing that's support, where have I got the high strategic relevance, what are my resources internally, and then really looking at the different ways that they're evaluating and measuring. So in this diagnostic, we really review the programs that you've got currently and where it sits on the scale. For anyone that reaches out to Jess and we organise a diagnostic in the next 30 days, there'll be a free copy of the book. And I'm keen to just, you know, be out there talking to people about learning transfer and helping companies just shift their perspective and focus. So thank you. Do reach out to Jess, and that's our short little plug over with. Much more important to be talking about you right now. And let's just check in. Tony, thank you. Yes, Marshall Goldsmith, great section of questions that he has. How did I do my best today on a certain commitment that you've put yourself forward to? And Tony, love you to share in the chat box if you've had examples of where that's worked well in organisations and you've managed to get momentum around people sharing over particular goals, or whether that's more individuals have done, but certainly it's a very, very similar idea. So guys, over to you now, and we wanted to do, yes, it's a bit worrying, that slide, isn't it? We should tone it down. We wanted to do a bit of an experiment, because we were talking in the office about saying, well, you know, are we out of integrity if we run a webinar without a learning transfer process? And is there a way that you should have learning and it never needs to be transferred, or does it always need to be transferred? So I'd be keen to hear in the chat box what people feel about that. But one of the things that we wanted to do was just give it a go with really saying, even if it's just one thing that we're taking away from this particular session today, what would we put into play? So for the Australians amongst us today, and we did have quite a broad international attendance. Neil, if you do a hashtag Friday Fives, we might have to hashtag Cal as well, or else he'll think I'm I'm trying to start up his old company. But happy for him to get involved. Yeah, so Maria, it's interesting. Is it just is it useful for it just to be out of interest and start a conversation and see where that goes? It could well be. And I think one of the things that it came down into the office is that it is really down to the individual. But if the individual does want to put things into place, what's a process that can actually help them move forward with that? So I'd love you guys to check, and did people receive in the post a rather eye-catching yellow envelope with their beautiful Australian postcard inside? Excellent. So it's been reaching out there. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Belinda. Yeah, good point, Tony. So maybe integrating what people have already learnt. So Craig, if your post hasn't arrived to you yet, maybe check your email inbox, or if not, Jess can get one emailed out to you right now. So Jess, are you on the chat box? Can you see that? So Jess will be getting, Maria moved address last week. Maybe it didn't get to you. So guys, do check your attachments in your email. Wonderful, Tracy, you've been there. So if those that have got the card to their hand, they can pick it up now. If not, you can see a copy on the screen in front of you here. And the section we'll be looking at is this target. So Jess, if we can look at Chris, Kelly, Marissa, Maria, and Craig. Yep, that's be coming out to you now, guys. But you can certainly just grab a piece of paper close to you. What I want us to take a moment to think about now, and we've got about 10 minutes as we go into the end of the webinar here, to really think about what's one thing that I learned, why is it important to me, and what specifically will I implement from today and by when. And it can just be a small thing to help you get moving forward, or you might want to be certainly a little bit ambitious. And I'm thinking if we choose something that we could implement, say, by the first week in August, that would be a good time frame. So we've got around 3 weeks there. So let's just take a moment to think now, what did you learn today? Why is it important to you? With the why behind the goal often being what will keep you moving forward rather than the goal itself. And then what specifically will you implement, and by when? And for those that are really fast and speedy, very happy for you to put what you're going to implement in the chat box also. So let's just take a moment now. Great, Tracy. That sounds like a goal to keep moving forward with. Nice insight there, Greta, that finding time to join the webinar has helped you learn some new things and can help you contribute to your organisation. And so, Greta, and maybe to others that are thinking about their learning as well, Kelly, when you look at what you've learned today as well, just think about what specifically could you do to move on or move forward with what you've learned today. maybe one step. Could be moving forward with just one part. It could be a conversation that you're going to have. Could be an email that could be sent. Could be something that, research or further information, which is an interesting one in terms of learning transfer, because that still is researching more in learning, or is it in the transfer piece? Postcard has gone out to some of you now. Karen, that's interesting with the evaluation. Also, I would say, Karen, check out Will Thallermeyer. He's connecting to me on LinkedIn. If you, I don't think I could give you his spelling of his name straight off the top of my head, but Will Thallermeyer, his work at the conference was fascinating on evaluation. So happy to pick up with you on that, Karen, if that's of interest and useful. Great, Sharon, you're going to work with Inner Calm with your team. Yeah, nice one. Get the team to clean up the workspace and drawers. So that's better than before is Gretchen's book, Sharon, if you want to reach out for that. And I think I bought it at an Australian Booktopia, I think. Excellent, Kate. So it sounds as if we've got some good learnings coming through there. Kate's going to be doing some Friday Fives. Perfect. Great, Trent. Of course, enjoyment of learning. All absolutely key to the part of the process. So guys, for the next part of our experiment, when we've used these postcards before, we've had people buddy up because they've been sat next to each other in conferences and things. And I spoke earlier about accountability being one of the absolute key points for behavioural change moving forward. And what I think is interesting is that, we have, I don't know how many of you work to-do lists. You have so many things on your to-do list that sometimes, because the learning item is a stretch and it's not something that your kind of life depends on, it can be really challenging to get yourself moving forward on that particular item. So what I'm going to encourage everyone to do now, you've put an hour of your time into this webinar, and I really feel if we can find an additional 30 minutes to do a follow-up call in a buddy process, it will really help you get huge value from today. So you've all been sent an email while we've been online here that will give you access. And I'll go back on my video, guys. I meant to go back on video a while back. I'm going to see if I can share. You'll be receiving an email that has got a form in it, and the email form asks you when you would be available for a 30-minute partner learning transfer conversation. And this is really, rather than filling out the first part of our, thanks Tracy, filling out the first part of our card, we've sent you an email into your inbox that gives an opportunity for you to send us your preferences for a call, and we will pair you up with someone else at a similar time. So this is where the experiment comes in, guys, because it's so much easier when we're actually in a room. Oh, Neil, it's only my face. You know what I look like. Could be in your top when your scroll bar pops up at the bottom, Neil. But anyway, I've only just popped back on. So what I want encourage you to do now is to go to your inbox, find the email from Jess. Aha, thanks, Craig. Tip there, exit full screen. And when you find the email in the inbox, to actually complete that form. And for our giveaway, once you've submitted that form, the 5th person to get their form back to us will get the book bundle, which has got my 2 books in it. Ravita, well done. Ravina, sorry, even. Thank you for that, Ravina. Tony, have you not got the email? Tony, let's Jess sent that through to you to double check that. We're just checking that now for you, Tony. I'll just talk you through what's in the bundle. So we've got my copy of Turning Learning into Action, which is certainly improving and in popularity the whole time, and it's got some real value about learning transfer. Making Change Work, which is the book that I've co-written with Jack and Patty Phillips. So Jack and Patty from the ROI Institute got very thorough ROI measurement methodology. So thrilled that we've managed to combine our two methodologies in this book. And then also my favorite of the moment, the Frederick Laloh's Reinventing Organizations, which is just an absolute gem of a read. So I'm guessing that everyone's busily looking at their emails at the moment. Tony, if you want to put in the chat box whether you're best for a phone call that's either 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th or 5th of August. Thanks, Fiona. Or maybe, Tony, just double check whether that email address is correct for you. And Karen, we will check yours. Okay. Tony, we noted you down, so we can do your form manually, Tony, Friday the 5th. And Karen, maybe if you want to just do your selection as well. And then, Jess, I will see if we have a, can we see if we have a winner? As we're multitasking at this end. Thanks, Trent, for sending your form in too. So I really look forward to connecting everyone by email. As I say, we won't share that with anyone else. Tracy Edwards is our winner. Tracy, thank you for being on the call today, and we will be getting those books out to you. Tracy, are you overseas? I have a feeling. I'm not certain, but welcome and lovely to have you here. So, Adelaide, that's fine then, Tracy. Very easy to do. Yeah, congrats to Tracy. And I know many of you have already checked out my book, but Frederick Laloux is really worth looking at as well. Awesome, guys. Very, very grateful for your energy and enthusiasm today, especially coming through on a chat box. I will save this and get this sent out to everyone as well. And we'll also have the video access that we'll be sharing. Thank you for, big thank you also for Jess. Mustn't forget that. Jess has done a fantastic job getting everyone together on today's call, creating the slides, getting me in order. So thank you to Jess. Wouldn't happen without you. And thank you to the audience and everyone who's participated today. Wonderful. Great work, guys. Wishing you all the best with your learning transfer and hope to catch you on a webinar again soon. Thanks, Neil. Best wishes, everyone. Bye. Stop recording.